The sun peeked over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the sprawling campus of Westfield High. The school, nestled in the heart of Austin, Texas, had long been regarded as one of the most prestigious institutions in the area. Its towering brick buildings, pristine sports fields, and well-equipped classrooms were a testament to the affluence of its student body. Many of the students who walked through its gleaming hallways came from well-to-do families, children of doctors, lawyers, and business magnates. Westfield High was more than a school, it was a launching pad for the elite, a place where legacies were built and futures were forged. As the first bell rang, students bustled through the hallways, filling the air with animated chatter. Some huddled in tight circles, exchanging weekend stories or gossiping about the latest social media drama. Others frantically scribbled answers onto their worksheets, hoping to finish their last-minute assignments before class. The air was thick with a blend of expensive colognes and perfumes, mingling with the scent of freshly waxed floors. Jacob Miller walked through the crowd, his presence going largely unnoticed by the majority. Unlike his peers, who sported designer backpacks and shoes that cost more than a month's rent, Jacob's attire was simple. Sturdy jeans, a well-worn flannel shirt, and a pair of scuffed cowboy boots that still carried the faint scent of soil. He moved with quiet confidence, though he kept to himself. That morning, however, something felt different. An unease settled in Jacob's stomach, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He had walked through these hallways countless times before, endured the same subtle, and sometimes not so subtle looks of condescension. Yet today, the weight on his chest felt heavier. Jacob knew he didn't fit in at Westfield High. While many of his classmates spent their mornings sipping caramel lattes from the on-campus cafe, he spent his tending to the farm before school. While they worried about their grades affecting their college applications, Jacob's concerns were more immediate: keeping the farm running, making sure the crops were in good condition, and helping his grandfather manage the day-to-day operations of their family business. He had learned resilience from an early age. His grandfather, James Miller, had built their farm from the ground up, turning a modest plot of land into a sprawling agribusiness empire. Hard work was in Jacob's blood, but that didn't seem to matter at Westfield High. To many, he was just the farm kid, the one who didn't belong. Jacob's hands bore the evidence of his labor. They were rough, calloused, and marked with small cuts from early morning chores. While his classmates had soft, manicured hands, his told a different story, a story of dedication, responsibility, and sacrifice. The faint scent of soil clung to his boots, a reminder of the life he lived outside these pristine walls. He often overheard whispers as he walked by. Some students made fun of his attire, others smirked at the dirt under his fingernails. The mockery was never direct, but it didn't have to be. The subtle comments, the shared glances, the slight sneers were enough to remind him that, in their eyes, he was different. But Jacob took pride in his work. Farming wasn't just a job, it was a way of life, one that had been passed down through generations. He understood the value of hard work in a way many of his peers never would. While they spent their summers vacationing in Europe or lounging by the pool, Jacob spent his days in the fields, working under the relentless Texas sun. Despite his quiet nature, Jacob's silence often made him an easy target. Some students saw his lack of response as weakness, as if his refusal to engage meant he didn't have the confidence to stand up for himself. Others saw it as an opportunity to assert their own superiority. "Hey, farm boy, did you bring us some fresh eggs today?" one student jeered as he passed by. A few others chuckled, their laughter echoing through the hall. Jacob ignored them, his expression unreadable. He had learned long ago that responding only fueled the fire. Instead, he focused on the ground ahead, his boots thudding against the polished floor. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the sting remained. He knew that, to them, he was nothing more than a novelty, a source of amusement. And that realization stung far more than their words ever could. Jacob's unease only deepened when he entered his history classroom. Miss Whitmore stood at the front of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the students as they took their seats. She was known for her high expectations, rigid discipline, and an air of superiority that made even the most confident students shrink under her gaze. She was impeccably dressed, her outfit pressed to perfection, her posture rigid. Every movement she made exuded authority, and she commanded respect, or rather, fear. Students rarely spoke out of turn in her class, knowing that even the smallest misstep would result in her sharp rebuke. Jacob had never been one of her favorites. In fact, it was quite the opposite. She saw him as an underachiever, someone who didn't belong in her class of intellectuals. Her tone whenever she spoke to him was laced with thinly veiled condescension, as if she expected nothing more than failure from him. When the lesson began, Jacob tried his best to focus, but exhaustion weighed heavy on his eyelids. The early mornings on the farm, coupled with the demands of school, often left him drained. It wasn't long before Miss Whitmore's sharp voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Miller," she said, her arms crossing as she fixed him with an icy stare. "Perhaps you can enlighten us about the primary cause of the Civil War?" Jacob hesitated, his mind scrambling to recall the notes he had skimmed through the night before. He had studied, but fatigue had clouded his concentration. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Miss Whitmore's lips curled into a smirk. "If you paid more attention in class instead of whatever you do out there in the fields," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "perhaps you wouldn't embarrass yourself." A few students chuckled. Jacob's face burned, but he remained silent. "Honestly, I don't see the point in wasting time on students who are clearly not cut out for academics," she continued. "Maybe you should stick to what you know best, feeding pigs and plowing dirt." The room fell silent. Even those who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably. Jacob gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The storm inside him raged, but he forced himself to remain calm. He met Miss Whitmore's gaze, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I may not be as book-smart as the rest, but that doesn't mean I don't deserve respect," he said. Miss Whitmore arched an eyebrow. "Then prove it," she said dismissively. "Otherwise, leave my classroom." The words cut deep, but Jacob didn't argue. Instead, he gathered his things, his heart pounding as he walked out of the classroom. He had never felt so humiliated in his life. Little did Miss Whitmore know, this moment would change everything, not just for Jacob, but for the entire school. And the next morning, Westfield High would witness something it had never seen before. Jacob's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he left the classroom, his face flushed with humiliation. The weight of Miss Whitmore's words pressed on his chest, each syllable replaying in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. He had always known he was different from his classmates, but today he had been made to feel lesser. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to turn back and say something, anything, to defend himself. But what good would it do? The whispers had already started. Students in the hall exchanged glances, their hushed voices carrying just enough for Jacob to catch snippets. "Did you see how she put him in his place? He should have just kept quiet. Farm boy doesn't belong here." Jacob bit the inside of his cheek and kept walking. He had always taken pride in his ability to keep his emotions in check, to not let their words get to him. But this time it was different. This time, the insult hadn't come from a peer, it had come from a teacher, someone who was supposed to guide and uplift students, not tear them down. As he reached his locker, he slammed it open, exhaling sharply. He didn't have the luxury of showing weakness. He had work to do, on the farm and in life. He just had to get through the rest of the day. The following morning, the students of Westfield High were met with an unusual sight. A sleek black helicopter hovered above the football field before descending gracefully onto the turf. The rhythmic thud of the blades sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd as students and teachers rushed outside to see who could possibly warrant such a grand arrival. As the dust settled, the door to the helicopter opened, revealing a tall, commanding figure dressed in a tailored suit. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as recognition spread. James Miller had arrived. The name was well known across Texas. James Miller wasn't just a farmer, he was the farmer. The man behind one of the most successful agricultural businesses in the country. His sustainable farming techniques had revolutionized the industry, supplying organic produce to top-tier restaurants and major grocery chains. Despite his wealth, he had remained a man of principle, valuing hard work and integrity above all else. And he had come to Westfield High for a reason. Jacob stepped out of the helicopter behind his grandfather, his posture straighter than usual, his face unreadable. The excitement in the crowd morphed into a stunned silence as realization dawned on them. The farm boy they had mocked, the student their teacher had belittled, was the grandson of James Miller. Miss Whitmore stood frozen in place, her usual composed demeanor visibly shaken. She had prided herself on control, on ensuring that her classroom maintained a certain standard. And yet, here she was, caught off guard by the very student she had dismissed. James Miller walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Miss Whitmore. His presence was commanding, and when he spoke, his deep voice carried effortlessly across the corridor. "I understand there was an issue with my grandson in your class yesterday," he said, his tone even but firm. Miss Whitmore blinked rapidly, straightening her posture as if trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. "Mr. Miller, I assure you, I treat all my students equally." James Miller tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" he asked, pulling a check from the inside pocket of his coat. "Because this school receives significant funding from the Miller Foundation. I built the very science lab you take pride in, and I sponsor the history program you oversee. Yet, despite this, you saw fit to humiliate my grandson over his background." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The color drained from Miss Whitmore's face as the weight of the moment settled upon her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Around them, students exchanged stunned glances, their previous assumptions about Jacob unraveling before their eyes. James Miller stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I raised Jacob to understand that hard work is honorable," he continued. "Perhaps you should educate yourself on that, instead of looking down on those who put food on your table." A hush fell over the crowd. The realization of how deep Miller's influence ran through the very foundations of Westfield High was dawning on everyone present. The history program, the very subject Miss Whitmore prided herself on, had been made possible by the man standing before her. And she had disrespected his grandson. Jacob, who had remained quiet until now, finally stepped forward. He looked at Miss Whitmore, not with anger, but with quiet resolve. "I don't need special treatment," he said, his voice steady. "I just want to be treated with respect, the same as anyone else." Miss Whitmore swallowed hard, finally breaking eye contact. "I understand," she said stiffly. "I apologize." James Miller nodded, a satisfied smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good," he said. "Because respect isn't given based on wealth or status. It's earned through integrity and hard work. And my grandson has both." As the helicopter's blades began to turn once more, the students erupted into cheers. Many gave Jacob nods of admiration, some even offering quiet apologies of their own. The boy they had once dismissed now walked through the school halls with his head held high. Not because of his grandfather's influence, but because he had shown everyone that dignity wasn't measured by books or bank accounts, it was measured by how one carried themselves in the face of adversity. And as for Miss Whitmore, she never underestimated another student again. In the days following his grandfather's visit, Jacob felt an undeniable shift in the air. The hushed whispers in the hallways had turned into murmurs of respect. Some students who had once mocked him now nodded in silent acknowledgement as he passed by. Others approached him cautiously, curiosity replacing their former disdain. It was a strange feeling, being seen in a different light, but Jacob didn't let it change him. He remained the same hard-working, humble young man he had always been. For the first time, he walked into Miss Whitmore's class without a sense of dread. Her usual air of superiority had been replaced by something more subdued. She no longer called on him with veiled contempt, nor did she make dismissive remarks about his background. It was clear that she had learned her lesson. But Jacob wasn't the kind to hold grudges. He answered when called upon, and when he struggled, he asked for help without fear of mockery. It wasn't just Miss Whitmore who had changed. Jacob had, too. He no longer hesitated to speak up, no longer shrank under the weight of expectations. He had proven to himself that he belonged, not because of his grandfather's status, but because of his own perseverance and integrity. One afternoon, as he was leaving school, a few students approached him, ones who had never given him the time of day before. Among them was Ryan, one of the more popular boys in school, who had often joined in the laughter at Jacob's expense. "Hey, Jacob," Ryan started, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. I just wanted to say that what you did the other day was pretty cool." Jacob raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. Ryan sighed. "Look, I'll be honest. I used to think farm work was just, easy. But seeing your grandfather and everything he's accomplished, man, I never realized how much goes into it." Jacob crossed his arms. Yeah, it's not just feeding pigs and plowing dirt. Ryan chuckled, nodding. Yeah, I get that now. He hesitated before adding, I was wondering, would you ever show me around your farm? I think it'd be cool to see how everything works. Jacob studied him for a moment before nodding. Sure. Come by this weekend. But don't expect it to be easy. Ryan grinned. I wouldn't have it any other way. That weekend, Ryan and a few other students arrived at the Miller farm, unsure of what to expect. Jacob met them at the gate, dressed in his usual work attire, worn boots, a simple t-shirt, and jeans stained with dirt. He smirked at their hesitant expressions. Welcome to my world, he said. Hope you're ready to work. The day was grueling. Jacob showed them how to feed the animals, clean the stalls, and even harvest crops. By midday, Ryan and the others were covered in sweat and dirt, exhaustion etched into their faces. I have so much respect for you right now, Ryan gasped, wiping his brow. This is harder than football practice. Jacob chuckled. Told you. By the end of the day, the students sat together, drinking cold lemonade as the sun began to set. For the first time, they saw Jacob not as the farm boy they had once dismissed, but as someone to be admired. Jacob had always known that success wasn't about wealth or status. His grandfather had taught him that true success came from hard work, resilience, and staying true to one's values. But now, he was starting to see that his story had the power to change minds. Miss Whitmore had underestimated him. His classmates had judged him. But by standing his ground and proving his worth through action, he had reshaped their perceptions. One afternoon, after school, Miss Whitmore stopped him outside the classroom. Jacob, she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He turned to face her, waiting. I was wrong about you, she admitted. About a lot of things. Jacob nodded. I know. She smiled faintly. You've taught me something important. Thank you. Jacob didn't need her validation, but hearing those words felt like a small victory. He had changed her perspective, not by force, but by simply being himself. As time went on, Jacob continued to carry himself with quiet confidence. He excelled in his studies, not because he had anything to prove, but because he wanted to. He helped his grandfather on the farm, learning more about the business side of things, preparing for the future. He no longer felt like an outsider at school. He had earned his place, not by changing who he was, but by staying true to himself. And in doing so, he had shown everyone that dignity wasn't about where you came from, but how you carried yourself in the face of adversity. One evening, as he and his grandfather sat on the porch watching the sunset, James Miller turned to him with a knowing smile. You did good, kid, he said. Real good. Jacob smiled, taking in the golden hues of the sky. He had a long road ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for whatever came next. As the weeks passed, Jacob noticed a shift in the school's atmosphere. The way students interacted with him, and with each other, had changed. The divide between social classes that had once been so pronounced seemed less rigid. More students started to appreciate different perspectives, understanding that everyone's struggles were valid in their own way. Even Miss Whitmore, once rigid in her ways, became more mindful in how she addressed students. She no longer assumed intelligence was tied to wealth or background. Instead, she focused on nurturing every student's potential, including Jacob's. It wasn't that Jacob had sought to change the school, but by standing his ground, he had unknowingly inspired a quiet revolution. His resilience had set an example, proving that respect wasn't something given based on status, it was something earned. One afternoon, Jacob was called to the principal's office. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as he stepped inside, he found not just the principal, but his grandfather waiting for him as well. Jacob, the principal said, smiling warmly, we've been impressed with how you've handled yourself over the past few months. And with your strong work ethic and leadership, we believe you'd be the perfect candidate for a special opportunity. Jacob's brow furrowed. What kind of opportunity? His grandfather chuckled. A scholarship, he explained. One that recognizes students who excel in both academics and practical skills. Your story, your hard work, it's exactly what this scholarship was created for. Jacob blinked, stunned. He had never considered himself scholarship material. He had always assumed those opportunities were reserved for students with perfect grades and polished resumes. "But I'm just a farm boy," he said slowly. His grandfather placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're much more than that, Jacob. You've shown leadership, perseverance, and integrity. And those qualities will take you farther than any textbook ever could." That evening, Jacob sat on the porch, deep in thought. The scholarship was an incredible opportunity. It could open doors he had never even considered before. But it also meant making a difficult choice. His grandfather joined him, a glass of iced tea in hand. "You've got a lot on your mind," he observed. Jacob nodded. "I never thought about leaving the farm. It's all I've ever known." James Miller sighed, looking out at the vast fields stretching before them. "I built this farm from the ground up," he said. "And I did it so that my family would always have opportunities. If staying here is what makes you happy, then that's what you should do. But if there's more out there for you, don't be afraid to chase it." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. "What if I fail?" His grandfather chuckled. "Then you pick yourself up and keep going. Just like you've always done." Jacob exhaled, a small smile forming. He knew the answer now. The following week, Jacob accepted the scholarship. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about embracing an opportunity to grow. He wasn't turning his back on his roots. He was carrying them with him, using everything he had learned on the farm to forge a new path. The day he left for college, the entire school gathered to send him off. Even Miss Whitmore, who had once doubted him, offered a genuine smile. "I expect great things from you, Jacob," she said. Jacob grinned. "I'll do my best." As he climbed into the truck, his grandfather patted his back. "Go make us proud, kid." Jacob nodded. He was ready. Years later, Jacob returned to the farm, not as a boy struggling to find his place, but as a man who had carved his own destiny. He had used his education to revolutionize farming even further, blending modern sustainability techniques with the hard-earned wisdom of his grandfather. Westfield High still remembered him. His story became one of inspiration, a lesson passed down to new students about resilience, hard work, and the true meaning of respect. And as for Miss Whitmore, she never underestimated another student again. As Jacob stood on the porch, looking over the land that had shaped him, he knew one thing for certain. He had stayed true to himself, and that had made all the difference.